So this is me long time ago. I was 2 years old in this picture. I was about 2 weeks, I was told, from being removed from my mother's household here in Madison, Wisconsin. I grew up in my earlier years in Truax, a neighborhood in Madison that's low income. Back then, it was public housing. We still had public housing then. But I was 2 years old in this picture and not with my mother because a few days before this picture was taken, it was decided by my family that I would never go back to live with her again. About a few days before that, I happened to be standing out on a busy street, East Washington Avenue in Madison, in a diaper and a t-shirt, getting ready to cross the street at a stoplight. Just was fortunate that my aunt and her daughter happened to be driving by at that same time. And they would always look over there because they always worried about what would happen to me. And so they looked to the right this day, and they just so happened to look long enough to see me standing there at the stoplight waiting for the light to change. They jumped out of the car, screamed, came, got me. I never went back to live with my mother again. But I grew up here. It's a beautiful place called Madison, Wisconsin, surrounded by these 5 wonderful lakes, nice Monona Bay. I had the opportunity to enjoy those as a young person. Still love the lakes, still love my hometown, but I had struggles here. And this was my mother. This is an article from November 25th, 1981. For about 15 years, from the late 70s until the early 90s, if they were looking for someone to talk about homelessness and the challenges that people experienced with it, they would often look for my mother. And where you could find her was where she spent most of her life living, which was on State Street, this wonderful street that this building is on, in the bus shelter in front of Starbucks, down by our university campus. That's where she lived. Occasionally, she would find her way into public housing or housing development for the homeless, but frequently she would be asked to leave because she had a really bad temper. But what was interesting about my mother was that she also had a very high IQ. I happened to be tested same way, high IQ, when I was a young kid, but this was a homeless person who would spend her evenings at our local technical college tutoring students in calculus. Isn't that amazing? But she zoned out on life because when she was a little girl, back then in the 1960s and 70s when she was coming up, or 1950s and 60s, it wasn't cool for a young girl, especially a young black girl, to be overweight, boyish in her behavior. You know, she liked rough sports, and but also to be extremely smart, nerdy. So you put all those three together, and she got teased religiously. She also was teased by, unfortunately, people who were very close to her. So she decided she was going to give up on society and go live on her own. And so when she was raising me, she had a lot of issues. We think that she was bipolar. But back then they didn't diagnose a lot of people with that. But this was me. I happened to manage to grow up, despite her challenges, with my aunt and nestled in a community of people who really supported me. But this picture was taken a couple weeks before my high school graduation. And what I was thinking in this picture, people thought, man, I look cool, he looks good. You can tell me I look good. I like to say, people say I look pretty. But in my eyes, what was really going on was I was really nervous about what my future was going to hold. Really nervous about it. I went through school, as many years of schooling as any kid in the United States goes through. And not once during that period did I really think about or really settle on what it was I could be or what it was I could do. I had no idea what my skills were. I had no idea what my value was. I had no idea where I was going. But where I was going after graduation, I had decided I was going to go into the United States military. This was my high school, West High School in Madison. I decided to go in the military because when I graduated from this high school, I started this school with 45 young men, African-American males. When I graduated, only 7 of us walked across the stage together. Only 7. And I barely walked across that stage. I was working to the last second to get all of my credits in so that I could graduate on time. And that was the goal that my aunt had set for me by that point. She was like, baby, just graduate on time. To take care of me and her daughter as a single mother, she worked several jobs. She always had a job and a half most of the time that we grew up, but she still found it hard to take care of me. So when I graduated from high school, I decided I was going to leave home. Didn't know what I was going to do, so again, I joined the United States Navy. And it was in the United States Navy that I figured out one thing that I was good at. If you can see, I'm holding a saber in my hand. 3 days into boot camp, I was sitting in the back of the ranks, or marching, supposed to be marching. And I always liked to sit in the back of the bus, sit in the back of class, so I could not be seen but could be heard, right? So I got into a fight with a guy in the back of the ranks. He kept stepping on my boots. And I said, finally I leaned back at him. I said, man, you better stop stepping on my boots. And he laughed at me. And I said, you know what? I leaned back and I elbowed him right in his face. And we started fighting right there. Now imagine being in the United States military in boot camp. Now you all have seen movies about boot camp. So you can imagine what happened next. So I had this man, he was a white guy from Detroit. And I say that because every time I go somewhere, and I tell people I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, they look at me like I'm suspicious. And I know what they want to ask me. It doesn't matter if they're black, white, Latino, they're like, are there black people in Wisconsin? And I wanted to tell them, it is a little cold up here, that's why I'm a few shades lighter. But also, guess what? I didn't know there were white people in Detroit. And that's where this guy was from. But it was also my first cultural immersion. I learned I could learn from people from other places like this. So this man walked back. He was probably 5'6", 5'7". You can tell I'm a pretty big guy. He came up to me and he said, grabbed me up. He said, you think you're bad, don't you? I said, yeah, I think I'm bad. And he said, oh, you really are bad, huh? I said, yeah, I think I'm in the military, so I could swear. I said, yeah, I think I'm bad. And he said, all right. He said, you're cool. Come march us to chow. So at that very moment, he made me the leader of 96 people and made me march up to the front of the ranks and march these people to chow. That's what we call going to eat. And I tell you that story because at that minute, my life had to change. I went from being an angry person to being an extraordinarily nervous and scared kid that quick. Because he told me, if you don't march us, and I could see the place right in front of us, right? But there were all these stop signs, and I wasn't paying attention. I didn't know how to stop these guys from marching. And so he said, if you don't, you're going to go work out with the Navy SEALs. That was one of the punishments. You can tell I didn't want to sign to be a Navy SEAL. So as I get up to the front, it happened to be this little guy, little Latino guy. I cannot remember his name. I don't know where this guy was from to this day. If I could see him, I'd give him a big hug. But he said, hey, and he told me everything to say to march these people all the way there. And what I learned again was I could learn from a lot of different people. But what I was doing was I was learning as I was doing. I was learning as I was doing. And so I came back home. It's a little time after the military. It took me a little while to get into college. I applied several times to get into Hampton University in Virginia, historically black college. After taking the SAT 6 times, they finally let me in, literally 6 times. When I finally met the dean of admissions, I asked her why she'd made me wait so long. And she told me, I just wanted to make sure that you were serious about being here because I graduated high school with a 1.5 GPA. I ranked 413th out of a class of 438. But my test scores to get in the military were outstanding. I got a 92 out of 98 and I 9 points on the military test. And so she called me an underachiever. So I started to think about what she was telling me about being an underachiever. And so I came back home with my wife. We got married early, started having kids early. And I was going to be a medical physician. I enrolled in the University of Wisconsin. I was on my way. But then I started to notice some things happening in my old neighborhood. The community changed dramatically. The kids I had known who I grew up with, I started to see that they were going to jail. They were having kids early. They were having a hard time finding jobs. And so I wanted to figure out what was going on. And this is what's happening right now. Right now in Dane County, this is what I saw back then 20 years ago. It's only gotten a little bit worse. 75% of black children right now are living in poverty. In my hometown, 92% can't read at grade level. 53% graduate from high school, and 3% are academically ready for college. That's it. So when I graduated from high school, I went through the military, I learned some leadership skills, I came back, I was going to do some great things in my community, and I saw these numbers, and it shocked me. But one thing that I learned as I was going through this too, was that not only did we have an achievement problem, we had this going on. Literally in our community, half of African American males are incarcerated. Half. They're incarcerated under probation under some form of court supervision. So while I was at the University of Wisconsin, I decided I had to figure out how I solved this problem, because I was dedicated to figuring this thing out. And it could be easy as saying, you know what, well, it's past discrimination, it's past issues with race, there's structural discrimination in employment and education. Those were all easy explanations that people have written thousands of articles about. But I thought that there was something much deeper than that connected to it, because again, I started to achieve when I went in the military, and I started getting the opportunity to learn while doing. And I had a company commander who was challenging me and peers who were supporting me as I was going along. And I was one of the harder cases of kids. So I started to think about, why do we send our children to school? We send them to learn how to read, write, and compute. We send them to learn how to think critically, hopefully. But ultimately, we send them to get a good job or to create one. So I started to think about, how do we do that with young people that I grew up with, so I could stop seeing those numbers that I have to keep putting up on the board every time I give a presentation. So I thought about, how do I explain this to people? So I happened to be in Washington, D.C. I was out there for a decade, working on education reform. And I had to find these crazy ways to explain to business people or people with resources who could help out how we figure this out. So I told them that there's always a gap when we talk about education and we talk about employment. There are people, if one silo you see here, and we give those people an education in this country so that they can hopefully go off and get that good job or create one, right? And there's always a gap. When we fill that gap in, from people going to education, whether kids or adults, by ensuring that they have what they need in order to succeed in education. And we hope that education is connected to what it is they need in industry. And we've done this before. So I started thinking about, how could we do this again for those kids that I grew up with? And so I studied this, and I said, you know, in the 1960s, the United States pumped a ton of money when Russia lost Sputnik in 1957. We were pumping a ton of money into science education in order to ensure that we would be industry leaders in that area. We put money into schools, we created National Science Foundation, we did all of this work to ensure that we could shrink the gap between these children and these adults and what they needed to accomplish in education and what education needed to produce in order to fuel industry. And we did it successfully. Within a 20-year period, we became world leaders in technology. And by 1990, there were very few people who could touch us, very few countries. So I said, you know what, if we think about that now and how we get and close these gaps for these young people who are in our schools, I looked at this, leading industries of our future. So I'm involved with a group that's looking at economic development in our region. And they pointed out, here are the areas that we'll see the most job creation: advanced manufacturing, biosciences, agriculture, food processing, learning information systems, healthcare, health information systems, and a number of other areas. But what stood out to me with that was, if we're relying on our current education system to produce young people who are going to do that, we do not prepare young people for that in school. We do not. But there's an opportunity that we could. So here's what's happening. The gap is growing. We've raised the standards on what we expect children to be able to do and know in education. So we've made it even more difficult for them. We've not really given their educators the tools that they need, nor hired the educators that already have the tools to ensure that they have that education. And all we do is measure education. We measure reading, mathematics. We measure reading, can they write, and can they compute. We don't measure anything else. So we'll send our children to school if that school has a lot of kids that can read. But what I want to know is, do they have an education that's going to prepare them to go out and get a job or create one? And we don't have a school system that does that. So the gap between education and industry is growing too. So parents who are sending their children to school, who think that, man, my kid is getting everything that they need, they could be an A student and end up unemployed. So here's what we're expecting of our children now. We have new educational standards, but we know that there are fewer low-skilled jobs for today's high school graduates. We also know that in my case, where I'm trying to work in urban areas, employers are leaving our inner cities, and there's increasing joblessness, poverty, homelessness, and hopelessness. So again, I started to think about these gaps that are growing, and I just said, you know what? How do we shrink these gaps? How do we bring it back to where it was before? And this is something I just want everyone to think about. We cannot really afford 4 separate strands of education. We have preschool, which parents generally pay for. We have K through 12 schools, where you have elementary schools that don't really speak to middle schools, that don't really speak to high schools, and preschools don't speak to elementary schools, but we're preparing these kids for the ability to create a job or to get work. But we're not talking to each other. Then we have technical colleges, and we have 4 universities. So I'm proposing that we eliminate technical colleges. I'm proposing that we eliminate them, because I'm trying to think about how do we get these kids ready for prime time. So here's my thought. Give kids up to 6 years to graduate. Give them up to 6 years to graduate. Let them take short mod and long mod classes. So we don't have to say, well, you got to stay in school an extra 5 years. You're not a smart kid. When my child starts school, high school, let them decide, this class I want to take 90 minutes or 2 hours. This class I want to take 50 minutes. Some kids who are accelerated and advanced may take all 50-minute classes. Other kids may need more time. But they get 4 to 6 years to graduate. But all of them also should leave with an associate's degree. So when I say eliminate tech colleges, I'm not talking about eliminate the need for technical school. I'm saying make technical school high school, so that every student leaves high school with a marketable skill that they can take out and immediately get a job or create one. And so, lastly, I'm going to say this very quickly. To do this, we have to create a new structure for schooling. So here's my proposal. We should have be a requirement that children, as early as grade 2, go to school. Let's just change the game. Right now, we say they don't even have to go to kindergarten. Let's make it a requirement that all have to go to school starting at 2 years old. And we keep them in primary school through grade 7, but we make sure that they can read, write, and compute and apply all those test scores that we worry about at those earlier grades. And we give them all the support that they absolutely need. And then we get them into secondary school. And again, 8th through 13th grade. And the reason why I'm adding the 13th grade is because if 50% of the kids don't graduate on time now, but if they stay in school an extra year, over half those kids will actually finish. Let's not be stupid. Let's just add that extra year. And let's make it a 6-year program. Again, some kids can graduate in 4, some kids will graduate in 6. Who cares if they all come out with a marketable skill that allows them to create or get a job? And then we can still have technical school, but call it advanced professional school. We don't need to spend as much money on it, because we're spending more of that money, those billions of dollars we're spending at tech colleges, in lower education. We're taking it and put it in the primary years. We need a little bit less of that at the top, but people to keep us current, we can send them to school and help them continue to polish up their skills. And then lastly, 4-year universities, they're too big to try to go away, and I don't want to take on that fight, right? And frankly, I kind of like some of these colleges. But we would send people to those schools who want to go there, who desire to get a 4-year degree. If they want to go get a degree in history, parents who worry about, can my kid get a job with a history degree, know that, well, guess what? Your child has a certificate in advanced manufacturing or in carpentry or an electrician. And so, yeah, they can still go do that while they also go to work and help pay for that education. So when I think about this and the kids that are in that gap, and my hometown in Madison, Wisconsin, if we did that, it would not matter if Kaleem grew up with his aunt and his mother lived in a bus shelter outside of a Starbucks on State Street in Madison, Wisconsin, it would not matter if I was a child of a doctor. We would all have the opportunity to start and end at the same place. And so when I think about where we will be in the future and what we can do to get all people there, I think we have to radically transform education, dramatically change it, and if we do it, I think we will be successful. Thank you so much.